It was December the 25th, 2003, and Christmas Day in Katana, Benin. The weather was nice, with a light warm breeze sweeping in from the Gulf of Guinea and inside the small terminal at Cajione Airport. The scene was very familiar. Families juggling luggage, agents sorting boarding passes, and ground staff preparing for the afternoon departure, which was one of the few international flights. On that particular day, just outside, on the ramp, stood a tired-looking Boeing 727, with the blue and white collars of Union Day Transport's Africaines UTA hastily painted on it, and barely covering the livery of the plane's previous owners. It had arrived a few hours earlier from Conakry, Guinea, and was now being readied for its next leg, which was a short hop over to Beirut, with a fuel stop in Libya. Now there was no reason to think that this flight would be any different from the previous flights. With this airline, it was a route that UTA flew regularly. Not glamorous or high profile, but very important. 2. The West African diaspora in the country. Heading over to the Middle East, many of the passengers had traveled from landlocked countries nearby. Some bussed in from Nigeria or Burkina Faso, carrying basically everything they owned. But like I said, the aircraft itself had definitely seen better days. It was over 25 years old by this stage, built in the United States and once operated by American Airlines. Now though, it was near the end of its service life, and had been patched together with used parts, of questionable provenance and maintained under the oversight of a struggling regional carrier, but it was still flying. And in this part of the world, where options on airlines were very limited, that was enough for the passengers, who likely had no idea of the state of the airline. As the ground crew loaded baggage and the passengers began to board, nobody on the tarmac had any reason to expect that this would be the final flight of this particular 700, and that was because everything looked completely routine. But as with so many accidents in aviation, this story actually didn't start suddenly. Now instead it had been building quietly, piece by piece, through important processes not being followed and corners cut for economical savings. So even though it didn't look like it, the ingredients were actually all there, and in less than an hour, they would finally all come together. The crew, who was going to operate UTA Flight 141, arrived on the tarmac just after 1 p.m. local time. Walking across the concrete, in the West African heat, there was no jet bridge, no air conditioning unit humming beside the aircraft, just a battered 727 baking in the sun and loosely assembled ground crew juggling passengers and baggage around it. In command of the flight was a Libyan national with 11,000 hours of total flight time, most of it having been operated on the Boeing 7. The captain had previously worked for Libyan Arab Airlines, back when the Boeing 727 still represented progress in modern aviation. That was years earlier, but he seemed content simply to still be flying the type. In the cockpit with him were a flight engineer with more than 14,000 hours of experience on the 7, and a first officer, likely also Libyan, though little could be discovered about his background. That lack of detail was until unusual. Union Day Transport's Africaines UTA kept almost no records of its personnel. Supporting the flight crew were 4 cabin attendants, 2 mechanics, and a local fixer who handled baggage and occasionally helped smooth relations with airport authorities. The same small group worked nearly every flight together, without formal schedules, contracts, or regulated limits on work and rest. Everyone was paid in cash. In practice, UTA functioned less like an airline and more like a bare-bones operation cobbled together on minimal resources. The company itself was controlled by Darwish Kazim and his family. UTA had no true headquarters, board of directors, or safety department, but Kazim often rode along in the cockpit jump seat, including on this particular flight, a factor that would later matter. Officially, UTA was based in Guinea, though that was more a matter of convenience. Guinea lacked the infrastructure and expertise to monitor or regulate an airline, meaning oversight was virtually non-existent. The aircraft told a similar story. Registered as 3XGDO, it had once flown for American Airlines in the 1970s. During the heyday of the 727 on U.S. domestic routes, by the late 1990s, as newer jets like the 737NG and 757 replaced older designs, this airplane had been retired and parked in the desert. UTA later acquired it and returned it to service under questionable circumstances. After a brief grounding in Lebanon for poor condition, it was patched up just enough to be allowed to fly and then sent straight back to West Africa. There were no maintenance logs, no engine hour tracking, and no overhaul documentation. Investigators later discovered that engine serial numbers appeared to have been altered, obscuring their actual service life. UTA also claimed to have commissioned a market study to evaluate its planned routes and operations, including demand forecasts, crew requirements, and fuel planning, but no trace of such a report was ever found. It was almost certainly never produced. In reality, UTA operated without the infrastructure, documentation, or technical expertise required for an airline. Its head of quality assurance, for instance, was not even licensed on the Boeing 7. Further, problems ran deeper. The company lacked maintenance manuals, never established a minimum equipment list, the document outlining which systems could be inoperative yet still legally allow flight, and left virtually no paper trail of airworthiness compliance. In effect, UTA was never a genuine airline. It was a loosely run business, using an aircraft far beyond its capacity to safely operate. Investigators later discovered that UTA had not preserved any proper dispatch records. Among the scattered paperwork in its files were references to airplanes the company had never owned, such as Lockheed L-1011s and Fokker 50s, as well as destinations it had never flown to. One investigator remarked that the manuals were obviously copied from other carriers, assembled in a clumsy fashion, and seemingly produced only to satisfy regulatory requirements. Another noted that the most coherent section of the airline's operations manual was a vague statement declaring that safety is everyone's responsibility, a principle the company showed no interest in actually applying. UTA's so-called headquarters was nothing more than a desk in a travel agency in Conakry, Guinea, also owned by its founder, Darwish Kazim. Its airport presence amounted to a rented check-in counter and 2 shipping containers on the property, one holding miscellaneous spare parts for the 727, the other stocked with paperwork and bottled water. There were no real offices, no dispatch department, no crew facilities, and no genuine manuals. Even the ownership and leasing arrangements of the aircraft were tangled. The 727 was nominally operated by UTA, but had been leased through a complicated network of shell companies designed to obscure accountability. That structure eventually pointed investigators toward Imad Saba, a businessman already known to French authorities. Saba had been linked to a number of so-called airlines that often existed only on paper, set up to provide services in jurisdictions where oversight was weak or non-existent. The system was structured so that if an accident occurred, no clear responsibility could be assigned, and legal action would hit a dead end. Several of Saba's ventures had been associated with suspicious activities, including allegations of arms smuggling. In fact, one of his companies had been cited by the United Nations for suspected embargo violations, and one of his aircraft had previously crashed while reportedly carrying humanitarian aid into Darfur. The pattern was familiar: forged or recycled documentation, poorly maintained aircraft, and operations in countries unable to enforce aviation standards. For investigators, the parallels were alarming. International aviation safety depends on strict regulations and cooperation between states, and it was precisely this framework that had made modern air travel so safe. By contrast, operations like UTA undermined those foundations, relying on loopholes, weak jurisdictions, and minimal accountability, a dangerous mix that would soon have tragic consequences. Most of the travelers on board were members of the Lebanese community living in West Africa. Many of them had been working abroad for years, and were returning to Lebanon for the holidays with their families. Because it was Christmas Day, luggage was stuffed with gifts for loved ones back home, and some families appeared to be relocating permanently, bringing even more belongings than usual. The check-in process at Katana was disorganized. Passengers were issued boarding passes without names, seats were not assigned properly, and investigators later learned that tickets were sometimes resold in the terminal. In practice, people who had no intention of traveling bought tickets simply to sell them at a markup to others desperate to get on the flight, similar to scalping concert tickets. This led to a chaotic boarding area crowded with shouting passengers, crying children, and bags piled high. To make matters worse, luggage and passengers were loaded without regard for proper weight distribution. Normally, a flight crew would have a detailed load sheet showing passenger numbers, baggage weight, and cargo distribution before departure. That document is essential to calculate whether the airplane is within safe weight and balance limits. But UTA was unable to produce a single proper load sheet for this or any other flight. Guinean authorities had never required them to keep such records, and airport services at Katana said the airline never requested copies either. What investigators did find were scattered documents from a completely different airline, Alpha Omega Airlines, with that company's name still printed on the paper. A few loose pages were also recovered from the cockpit, but none of the documents agreed with each other. Each listed a different basic operating weight for the 727, sometimes even for the wrong version of the aircraft, making them useless. The seating situation revealed just how overcrowded the flight had become. The Boeing 727 in question had 140 passenger seats, plus 4 flight attendant jump seats, 2 cockpit jump seats, and 6 additional seats meant for company staff, 152 in total. Every single seat was filled, and 2 company executives were sitting in the cockpit. Records show that 86 passengers boarded at Conakry, 9 disembarked at Katana, and 73 more joined there. On paper, that came to 150 passengers. Among them were 15 Bangladeshi army officers returning home from UN peacekeeping duty. The largest single group however, was around 100 Lebanese nationals heading back to Beirut. On top of this, 6 infants were carried as lap children. That meant at least 150 passengers were on board, possibly more, since estimates later suggested the real number could have been as high as 160, if true. A dozen or so people may have had no assigned seats or seatbelts at all. Roughly 30 minutes before departure, the cockpit voice recorder began capturing the crew's conversations. The first officer immediately raised concerns about the paperwork, noting that the sheets they had been given listed only passenger numbers but no weight information. The captain replied that at least they had the passenger list, but the first officer pushed back, pointing out that many passengers had enormous suitcases, some perhaps weighing as much as 200 kilograms each. He warned that unless the baggage was unloaded and properly weighed, the aircraft might struggle to take off at all. During the cockpit voice recording, the first officer kept insisting that the baggage should be properly weighed, so they could calculate the aircraft's load correctly. From the jump seat, the airline's director general interrupted, claiming the weight figures were already listed. The first officer pushed back firmly, pointing out that the paperwork contained no such details and that each passenger had brought oversized luggage. He warned that with 100 travelers each carrying heavy bags, the weight would be far beyond what was safe. His words were stark. If the aircraft managed to take off at all, they might still end up in the sea. The Director General seemed to realize he might be wrong, but rather than take responsibility, he shifted the blame and pressured the pilots to proceed. He remarked that once they reached Beirut, he would tell him off. Apparently referring to his father, then excused himself by saying there was nothing more he could do. The first officer tried to propose a compromise. Let the passengers fly, but leave the baggage behind in Katana. This exchange showed clearly that the flight crew, especially the first officer, recognized that the figures provided to them were unreliable, and that the aircraft might not be safe to fly. But without support from company procedures, manuals, or regulatory backing, they were trapped. Their employer was urging them to continue, and irregular operations like this had likely become normal for them. In such an environment, refusing to fly was much harder than it sounds in hindsight. Although the jet was close to its maximum weight, that alone wasn't the biggest problem. The runway was long enough, and the 727 had adequate thrust. The real danger lay in weight distribution. Without knowing where the passengers and baggage were positioned, the crew could not be certain how to set up the airplane for takeoff. That brings us to stabilizer trim. This system adjusts the angle of the horizontal stabilizer on the tail, which directly influences the airplane's pitch attitude. Trim must be set correctly before takeoff. Too little nose-up trim makes it almost impossible to lift the nose, while too much causes the aircraft to pitch up on its own before reaching safe speed. On an earlier flight, this very airplane had rotated prematurely due to improper trim, forcing the pilots to push the nose down until enough speed was gained. To set trim properly, pilots need accurate data on 3 things: fuel quantity and distribution, passenger seating, and baggage weight and placement. On this flight, the crew only had reliable information about the fuel. Passenger distribution was uncertain, and baggage details were a complete guess. To understand why this matters, consider how pilots think about the center of gravity, CG, the point where the aircraft's total weight can be thought of as concentrated. It's like balancing a pencil on your finger. The exact spot where it stays level is its CG. Opposing this is the center of lift or center of pressure, the point where the wing's aerodynamic force can be thought to act. Since the wings taper and sweep back, engineers simplify this by defining the mean aerodynamic chord, MAC, an average reference line across the wing's profile. The CG's location is measured relative to this MAC. Keeping the CG within limits is vital for controllability. If it's too far forward, the aircraft resists rotation. If it's too far aft, the nose may rise uncontrollably. In this case, the crew had no reliable way to know where their CG actually was. For an airplane to remain stable in flight, its center of gravity must sit slightly ahead of the point where the wings generate lift. That forward position naturally produces a nose-down tendency, which is then balanced out by the horizontal stabilizer pushing downward at the tail. The interaction of these 3 forces, the center of gravity, the lift of the wings, and the tail-down force creates stability and contractibility. If the balance is off, even a small shift in weight could cause the airplane to pitch uncontrollably forward or back. This is why airlines insist passengers stay in their assigned seats for takeoff and landing. The crew must know exactly where the aircraft's center of gravity is. When loading, they calculate its position along the mean aerodynamic chord MAC, an average line across the wing's profile. For example, if the center of gravity is 25% MAC, that means it sits 1/4 of the way along that line. Aircraft manuals then provide the correct stabilizer trim setting for each CG position. A more forward CG requires extra nose-up trim to counteract it. On this flight, the crew assumed the jet weighed about 172,000 pounds, and that the CG was around 19% MAC. Based on those numbers, they set their stabilizer trim to 6.75 units, nose up. But that 19% estimate was little more than a guess. In reality, the CG was at 14% Mach 5 percentage points further forward because ground staff in Katana had loaded nearly all the luggage into the forward cargo compartment. With the CG that far forward, the proper trim should have been closer to 7.75 units nose up, not 6.75. A difference of 1 unit may not sound like much, but in marginal conditions it can mean the difference between a safe liftoff and a failed takeoff. The result was that the aircraft was mistrimmed, probably overloaded, and now facing a hot, humid afternoon with only a slight headwind. Even before departure, problems continued. Passengers were standing in the aisles, refusing to sit down, and the cabin crew struggled to get everyone settled so the aircraft could move. The pilots knew they were heavy, so they planned to use every foot of the available runway. To give themselves a margin, they selected a rotation speed VR of 137 knots appropriate for a takeoff weight of 187,000 pounds, which was actually 15,000 pounds more than the weight they had declared. It was a sensible choice to account for the extra mass they suspected was on board. They also chose to switch off the air conditioning system during takeoff, squeezing a bit more thrust out of the engines. But thrust was not the critical issue. The bigger danger was the aircraft's balance. At 13 hours 58 minutes and 1 second, the 727 lined up at the threshold of runway 24, and the first officer, acting as pilot, flying, advanced all 3 throttles. The jet began its takeoff roll. Controllers in the tower noticed right away that the acceleration looked unusually slow, even with the engines at maximum power. The aircraft took far longer than normal to reach VR, when it finally hit 137 knots. The captain called V1, rotate, and the first officer pulled back on the yoke, but the nose barely lifted. Flight data showed only a sluggish, shallow rotation of a few degrees. To understand the aircraft's behavior, investigators used a method called reverse performance analysis. By combining data from the flight recorders such as acceleration, rotation point, and initial climb, they worked backward to identify the only possible combinations of weight, balance, and trim that could have produced what was observed. Because the Boeing 727's aerodynamics were well known, Francis B. could run the numbers through an official flight dynamics model. The results pointed to a takeoff weight of around 188,500 pounds, far heavier than what the crew had declared, and very close to the maximum that the runway could accommodate. In fact, this was even more than the safety buffer weight the pilots had used in their own calculations. The cockpit voice recorder captured the captain urging the first officer, rotate, rotate, more, pull, pull. But significantly, there were no sounds of alarms, failures, or abnormal noises. The engines were working. The flight controls were intact. The issue was that the stabilizer trim wasn't providing enough downward force on the tail, leaving the elevators unable to raise the nose effectively. Takeoff in this condition wasn't impossible, but it demanded a very forceful pull on the control column, estimated at about 100 pounds of effort, 45 kilograms. That's far more than what most airline pilots ever experience. Under normal circumstances, smooth and moderate inputs are expected, especially on takeoff, where sudden or excessive pitch changes risk tail strikes or stalls. A full aggressive yank on the controls is almost never required in a healthy airplane. So when the aircraft responded sluggishly, the first officer hesitated. By the time he did pull harder, the runway was nearly gone. Only about 300 meters remained when the nose finally began to rise, and the jet lifted off barely. It skimmed just above the ground, in ground effect, struggling to climb. Unfortunately, only 118 meters beyond the runway's end stood a concrete blockhouse, part of the localizer system. Just 2.5 meters tall, it had been built decades earlier and did not meet modern clearance standards, but it remained in place due to a lack of airport upgrades. The 727 cleared the runway end at barely 1.2 meters of altitude. The blockhouse was 2.4 meters high. At 13 hours 59 minutes and 11 seconds, 70 seconds after the takeoff roll began, the landing gear slammed into the structure. The impact tore off the roof, twisted it aside, and injured a worker inside. It also ripped the main landing gear out of the airplane and damaged the right wing flaps, further reducing lift. From that moment, survival was impossible. The aircraft staggered forward, clipped a perimeter wall with its tail, and then slammed onto the beachfront just beyond the airport. The fuselage broke into 3 large pieces. The tail separated. The cockpit crumpled forward, and the main body flipped into shallow water upside down. Inside, chaos reigned. Many passengers had not been wearing seatbelts and were thrown violently. Some were killed instantly. Others drowned, unable to find an exit in the overturned, flooded cabin. The water was shallow, but because the aircraft was inverted, it was deep enough to trap people inside. The first officer, the same pilot who had pleaded earlier for a baggage offload, was badly injured and later died in hospital. The captain, flight engineer, and the airline's director general managed to crawl out through breaks in the fuselage and survived. Many of the other survivors escaped only because they could swim out through holes in the wreckage. Rescue efforts were painfully slow. The airport had no dedicated crash response team capable of handling a disaster of this scale. Local civilians, fishermen, and nearby residents were among the first to reach the wreck, wading into the water to help. In the end, at least 141 people lost their lives. The true number may never be known. Many passengers boarded without tickets or proper records, and the lists did not match. Some indicated 145 passengers, others 149. The 727 had only 143 seats, not counting infants. 12 bodies were never identified, and at least 7 people were listed as missing without being recovered. It's possible the sea carried some victims away. The final toll is believed to be between 141 and 148 deaths, with only 22 survivors, all of them injured. In the aftermath, UTA's fragile structure collapsed. With no reliable passenger manifest, no proper records, and no local authority able to handle an investigation, Benin appealed for help. Francis B. stepped in and ultimately issued a blistering report. It described an airline that barely existed, flying an aircraft with no clear documentation, staffed by crews with unverifiable qualifications, carrying passengers whose identities weren't recorded. Despite the damning findings, there were no convictions, no successful lawsuits, and no regulatory action from the airline's home state of Guinea. The B emphasized that this was not just a matter of poor management. It represented a complete breakdown of aviation oversight and responsibility. They urged ICAO, the Global Aviation Authority, to tighten member states' obligations for licensing and supervising airlines. Without such measures, they warned, the entire international aviation system could be undermined. Today, the remains of the 727 are gone, but the crash stands as a stark reminder of what happens when safety rules are ignored, when oversight fails, and when accountability disappears. It is a tragedy that underscores why strict enforcement of aviation standards is not optional, but essential.